Thank you, Kathir. That was great. And for the first time, anesthesia did not delay us today. So our our it's okay. We're friends. It'll work. So our last talk for today is another special one. Paul Mahoney, who really requires no introduction, is an internationally renowned interventional cardiologist with expertise in coronary, structural, and God knows how many more interventional and transcatheter techniques. The exciting part for us that we are incredibly blessed that Paul will be joining UPMC Harrisburg, joining Hemel and his team. So we're absolutely delighted to have Paul and would love to hear Paul's version of what he thinks the future will look like for structural heart therapies and heart valve therapies. Welcome, Paul.
Well, thank you very much, Yves. And first of all, I hope you can hear me. And secondly, thank you for the kind introduction. I'm very excited about what the next few months hold. Let me share my screen here. Are you seeing this? Excellent. All right. So what I've been asked to talk about is the next thing, potential game-changing clinical trials coming up in structural heart. And I realize I'm the last speaker in a long line, so I'm going to try to keep it light. And let me use these controls. So what are the critical clinical trials in 2023? So my goal is to identify current clinical trials that could change the standard of care of treatment of patients with valvular heart disease. The criteria I used was I looked at all the structural heart trials that are enrolling or in follow-up, but not yet completed or published. And I looked at things that might be potentially changing the standard of care, new indications, new techniques, and novel technology. And I looked at aortic, mitral, and tricuspid. I try to stay within those guidelines. This is my opinion only. It's not comprehensive. I'm ignoring a lot of equally good clinical trials. So feel free to lob fruit at the screen if you don't like the ones I picked. The first one has been going on for a while. It's called early TAVR. And we talked about it a little bit. One of the previous speakers in the session did a really beautiful job talking about moderate AS and what really is moderate AS. But what early TAVR looks at is comparison of an early intervention TAVR versus conservative management for what's called asymptomatic severe aortic stenosis. So there's some questions. One is, how much risk does asymptomatic severe AS convey? Should we intervene on severe asymptomatic aortic stenosis? And really, you know, the conventional thinking and most of the clinical practice in the audience is if someone has AS, unless you're having symptoms, we don't intervene. But what does that really mean? Is there no risk to having asymptomatic aortic stenosis? And when we look at data from control arms of medical therapy versus AVR and asymptomatic AS, we find over a threefold increase in all-cause mortality in this group. If you do stress testing, and again, when we trained, stress testing of severe AS was considered contraindicated. However, it's very useful. And our clinical practice now is asymptomatic severe AS is we do stress testing. And the reason for that is if you have an abnormal stress test in the presence of quote unquote asymptomatic severe aortic stenosis, you have a six-fold increase in cardiac death. So what the early TAVR trial is doing is, and it's completed enrollment, it looks at asymptomatic severe AS, does a screening stress test. If you don't pass the stress test, if you have a positive stress test, you're excluded and you go to the most appropriate therapy, TAVR, clinical trial, surgical AVR. If you're asymptomatic, you get in the trial and you're randomized 1-to-1 to transfemoral TAVR versus clinical surveillance. And this is going to answer a very important clinical question and really change the way we take care of these patients. It's already in a lot of ways, and one of the reasons I want to start and highlight it in clinical practice, and it sounds like most of the speakers today are on board. Everybody who is quote unquote asymptomatic with moderate severe aortic stenosis, a low-level stress test can be very helpful in risk stratifying patients who either ignore or not fully aware of the symptoms they're having. All right. The next trial is also going to be an aortic stenosis trial. It's a SMART trial. All right. This is sponsored by Medtronic, and it's the first head-to-head comparison of an intraannular balloon expandable valve, SAPIEN, versus suprannular self-expanding TAVR platform, Evolut. And it's designed for patients with small annuli. Hemodynamic differences will be the most apparent. And the idea is, are the more favorable hemodynamics of a self-expanding platform, does this translate to clinical outcomes versus balloon expandable patients with small annuli? Now, Medtronic sponsoring it, they feel very strongly they have a better product. But this is the first head-to-head comparison. We're going to get a ton of data out of this, including pacemaker rates, stroke rates, vascular complication, death, and valve durability. It's randomized 1-to-1. They have to be eligible for both valves by trial. I was on the screening committee. We were very careful about that. And we're looking at co-primary endpoints at 12 months of death, disabling stroke, and heart failure hospitalization, and also bioprosthetic valve dysfunction. We are, for the first time, going to get a clean look at a head-to-head comparison and really be able to analyze these two good platforms against each other. So keep your eyes out on that. And the last one under aortic stenosis I want to talk about was a little bit of a blue sky project. This is currently a surgical trial, but it's a biopolymer, life polymer, Foldex valve. And this is a non-mechanical valve with leaflets that are polymers. So think about if we can get a polymer valve that lasts indefinitely, we can get rid of mechanical valves. We can do a single operation or a single TAVR implant, and we'd be fine for life. And this is currently being looked at. It's very early on. We've only seen early feasibility in surgical arms, and we have data out to 365 days that shows, at least in the short term, the valve is durable. And that was a small trial. It's now going to a pivotal trial. And there is a TAVR platform to follow. This again hasn't started yet, but they will have a transcatheter polymer-based implantable valve. And these are obviously potential game changers. If either of these platforms stick, we don't have to worry about valve and valve. We don't have to worry about valve failure. It'd be very interesting and revolutionary in the field. More to follow on that. So changing gears over to mitral intervention. We have a very effective tool, and several of our earlier speakers, starting with Dr. Smith, did a really nice job talking about how far transcatheter edge-to-edge repair has come. And you can see a nice result here of a very severe AS treated with mitral clip. When we look at the EXPAND registry, which is a contemporary registry, we published this data. My former site was #1 enroller in the G4 registry, and we looked at it, and we found that we were able to reduce MR to, in 90% of the patients, to 1+ or less. This is a very effective tool. We see a durable and immediate improvement in functional status. And MitraClip has matured to the point where you can treat most patients at very low risk with a 90+% chance of getting MR reduction of mild or less, and about a 98-99% chance of getting less than 2+ MR. And this is going to lead us, we saw the device times are shorter. The functional capacity QOL is good at 30 days. And we now have 4 clip sizes, as previous speakers mentioned. So, and I'm really glad that an earlier speaker brought up the Repair MR trial, because if TEER is swimming in the deep end of the pool and we're claiming surgical-like results, we need a head-to-head comparison with open surgical repair, which remains the gold standard. We need a surgeon to think they have a 95% confidence in the success of a valve repair, and that's going to be randomized 1-to-1 surgical repair versus transcatheter, looking at short and intermediate term outcomes. This is ongoing enrollment, and I'm very excited to see if this how this falls out, and this will either keep TEER in the high and operable risk patients, or it'll expand it down to intermediate risk and then potentially even low risk patients. And we'll see what the results of that. There's been a lot of discussion, a lot of good discussion about transcatheter mitral valve replacement. This becomes much more complex, and the challenges are greater here than in TAVR. We're not putting a valve in a tube. We've got a saddle-shaped annulus versus a circle annulus. We have apical and transeptal approaches that have their merits, and we have a wide variety of sizes. And importantly, we have the risk of LVOT obstruction, which is a life-threatening complication, which currently requires a lot of off-label maneuvering to address. I'm going to talk specifically about the trial Tendyne. I think it's a pretty critical one right now for a couple of reasons. This is and we saw a nice case. I think one of the earlier speakers showed a Tendyne case done at UPMC, and it was a beautiful result. Here you see the valve. It's placed apically. You get an immediate good result. It has a tether, which is what requires the transapical approach. Most importantly about Tendyne, and why I think this is a critical trial for our field, is that it's the only TMVR trial that's randomized to transcatheter edge-to-edge repair, which has become the gold standard, is approved, and is an option for a lot of these patients. So we're going to get a direct head-to-head comparison of TMVR versus TEER, all right? And so it's a pretty critical trial for you to know about for a couple of reasons. One, it's going to be the first to an endpoint. We're going to hear about this one first. Number two, it's randomized. So we'll have a transeptal component for edge-to-edge repair versus replacement. We will have to look at this within the context that it's transapical, however, because we have a lot of good platforms coming right after this that will be transeptal. But this will be a critical one to look at the results of the Summit trial when we see this. One of the valves that's transeptal that I have a lot of experience with and we like is the M3 valve. This is an Edwards product. With TMVR, one of the critical issues is how to anchor the valve. So the concept is you place a dock or an anchor. This will function, if you will, like a mitral valve ring or valve, and you'll put a sapien-like valve in this, and using the ring, valve, and leaflets of the native valve, you'll deliver a competent valve. And this is currently late stages, and we're about halfway through the pivotal trial. It's a 25 French septal system. It's got two parts. It's got a dock and it's got a valve. You can see here as a patient with critical critical mitral regurgitation. Okay, a loop is formed in the atrium using a ton of guidance. We access the medial commissure. Once you've accessed the medial commissure, you drive the circular ring around the anterior and the posterior mitral valve leaflets. You form this dock or circle that you can see in the left panel, and then you simply implant valve in valve, which we're all familiar with and have a lot of competency with. And the results so far have been good. We expect this trial to complete enrollment probably within about 8 or 9 months. And this is a low-profile transeptal system with a relatively low rate of screen failure. It's got about a 50% screen failure rate, with others are 90 or 95%. So keep your eye out for M3. Hemel showed a case. I know that we have Intrepid TMVR is now a transeptal system. It's still 35 French. There's an iteration coming right behind it. It's going to be 29 French. I think it's going to be a little bit more competitive. Intrepid is still bogged down by a very high screen failure rate. In the appropriate patients, and I put a bunch of them in, we do get good results, but the LVOT risk remains a problem one with this valve platform. One mitral platform that takes kind of a unique approach to this is the Alta valve. And the Alta valve eliminates the question of LVOT obstruction entirely by putting nothing in the LVOT. The entire valve is contained in the left atrium. It fills the left atrium with a valve facing the patient's native valve and allows flow that way. It's conceptually very exciting. It's a transeptal system. It's early generation. It's early feasibility, and it remains to be seen if this is going to be a technically usable platform. But it does solve a lot of problems that we don't see with the other platforms. So that's the Alta valve. And here are some of the features of that. It's an open cage. They 3D print it. They get the best size they can. The best estimation of size they can. There's a built-in 27 valve in the middle of it that aims towards a mitral valve, and it brings the entire valve function in the left atrium, and there's no risk of LVOT obstruction. All right. Lastly, moving on to tricuspid, we heard a couple of really good talks earlier about both edge-to-edge repair and valve replacement. I wanted to touch on these. Edge-to-edge repair is, you can see here a patient with severe TR. Okay. This can be treated. It can be treated percutaneously with a modified MitraClip system. Both Pascal, which is an Edwards product, and MitraClip have versions for the tricuspid valve, and they both are effective. You can get leaflet grasp, and you can reduce the amount of MR. As some of the previous speakers have said, we've changed our grading of MR to show that you can go from torrential down to just severe, and that's a clinical improvement. The Triluminate data was presented only last month at the ACC, and we saw the primary endpoint was in favor of intervention, but it was driven entirely by quality of life changes. Surprisingly, heart failure hospitalization rate was not better in this group, although the TR reduction was significant, and death did not show an endpoint yet. However, these are desperately ill patients. Anybody who's done these patients and gotten a good result is very gratified by the clinical improvement that the patients see. And virtually all of them would say, if you don't affect my survival, I really want to feel better. So I think this is a breakthrough technology. What is also really exciting, and one I think you need to pay close attention to, is the Evoke valve. This is an Edwards product. It's a transcatheter tricuspid valve replacement for severe TR. We've done 15 or 20 of these at my prior institution. The early data from TRISCEND 1 shows survival and freedom from heart failure hospitalization to be very favorable. Okay, and the functional improvement mimics that we're seeing in Triluminate. With it 1 year, we had significant improvement in KCCQ12, and 6-minute walk test was all much improved. One of the things I will say, having done a lot of Triluminate and a lot of TRISCEND, is that this is a 30-minute procedure, not a 3-hour procedure. It remains heavily imaging dependent. You have to be symbiotic with your imagers. You use multiplanar reconstruction. You simply access the RV apex through a venous stick, bring the valve across the tricuspid valve. You notice in this patient has pacemaker leads. This valve can work around pacemaker leads. There's a previous surgical valve replacement, a previous CABG. The valve is very, very carefully simply unrolled. It's a very calm procedure. The patients are hemodynamically extremely stable. You have a lot of time to fine tune this. The delivery system is excellent. and you can deliver a valve usually in about 25 to 35 minutes. And there's no TR when you're done. The amount of TR at the end is usually trivial, and the patients are usually discharged the next morning. And then lastly, a little bit more blue sky. There's new systems out there. This is one of them called the Tric valve that avoid the tricuspid annulus entirely, and they put a valve in the SVC and the IVC as a novel approach to treat right-sided problems. And this very nicely takes care of any anchoring or pacemaker problems. So I'll leave you with that. I know it's the end of the day and everyone's been very patient. And I want to thank everybody for their time. I just wanted to run through what I thought were some interesting trials that most people should be aware of. So thank you very much for your time.